He woke up before the sun, just like always. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your hands ache before you've even stood up. The window was cracked from an old break that never got fixed, and the wind slid through the gap like a whisper reminding him where he was. Around him, the silence of the apartment was heavy and familiar. His mattress was nothing more than a thin layer of foam over splintered floorboards. His alarm clock was his internal rhythm, trained over years of hustling, surviving, calculating how much could be done in 24 hours if you didn't waste a second. Outside, the neighborhood moved slowly. Trash lined the sidewalks. Someone yelled 2 blocks away something about rent. A car alarm shrieked and stopped. There were people already heading to the bus stop, heads down, shoulders hunched against a wind that didn't care about schedules or dreams. He moved quietly, slipping on the same hoodie he'd worn all week, the one with frayed sleeves and a stain on the cuff he couldn't scrub out. He didn't own much, but what he had, he used. By the time he reached the corner store, the owner was unlocking the door. They exchanged a nod, nothing more. He grabbed a bottle of water, paid in crumpled bills, and stepped back into the cold. The city was waking up, but it wasn't awake for him. It never had been. His entire life had been shaped by the idea that people like him were supposed to stay small, stay quiet, stay grateful just to be here. He didn't agree. The train station was crowded, packed shoulder to shoulder with people trying to get somewhere that maybe didn't want them either. He kept his headphones in, not for music, but to avoid the world. Eyes passed over him like he wasn't there. Some avoided him completely, stepping to the side like proximity might stain them. A few glanced down, took in the hoodie, the scuffed shoes, the cracked phone in his hand, and looked away with that familiar mix of pity and dismissal. But he was used to that. More than used to it, he relied on it. By the time he reached the heart of the city, the sun was up. The glass towers caught the light and scattered it in all directions, throwing long shadows across clean sidewalks and polished steel. He stepped into the flow of professionals, men and women in sleek coats, tailored suits, sharp shoes. They walked with purpose, the kind born of belief that the world made space for them automatically. No one looked twice at them. No one questioned their place. When he stepped into the lobby of the tech startup's headquarters, the temperature changed, figuratively and literally. It was warmer, quieter, designed to be impressive without being loud. Marble floors, soft lighting, green wall installations that looked alive. It was all curated, intentional, meant to tell you something before anyone even spoke. He stood in line like everyone else. He kept his hood down, eyes forward, shoulders straight. A few people ahead of him had company badges already. Some scanned their wrists to pass through the gate. He didn't move. He waited. He watched. And he listened. Behind him, 2 young men were talking. One had the kind of accent you could only get from private schools and cities that never worried about rent. The other laughed a little too loud, like he'd never been told to be quiet in a room. They didn't whisper. They didn't need to. When they talked about people from the hood, they meant it as a joke. When they said ghetto, they meant it as a warning. And when they looked at him, standing there in his weathered hoodie, they thought they were safe in their assumptions. He didn't respond. He never did. He let people write his story for him in their heads, knowing they'd never get past the cover. That's why, when the door opened at the far end of the lobby and the executive assistant stepped out, calling his name with urgency and familiarity, everything changed. The silence wasn't loud. It was clean, sudden, shocked. She ushered him in like someone important, like someone expected. The room tilted, but none of this had happened by accident. He had spent years studying, not in universities that came with legacy scholarships, but in libraries, community centers, internet cafes. He read until his eyes burned. He coded on borrowed machines. He worked jobs that left his hands blistered and his body aching, then went home to rebuild prototypes in the dark. He'd pitched ideas in rooms that locked up when he left. He'd been told no more times than he could count. But he learned. And when the market shifted, when tech giants began acquiring talent from unexpected places, he had already positioned himself where they had forgotten to look. While they laughed, he raised capital. While they dismissed, he filed patents. And now he wasn't here for a meeting. He was here for ownership. The conference room was built for power. Everything about it, the glass walls, the brushed metal fixtures, the weight of the chairs, was designed to remind people that they were being watched, evaluated, judged. It wasn't intimidating to him. He had been in more hostile rooms. Rooms where the ceiling leaked. Rooms where no one looked up when you entered. Rooms where the world tried to crush you with silence, not architecture. He sat at the end of the table, the one meant for the decision-maker. It wasn't about dominance. It was geometry. You either occupied the point or were part of the curve. The woman in the gray suit, the executive liaison, laid out the schedule for the day. He listened, nodded once, and then let her speak into the rhythm of the room. She was sharp. Trusted. She'd seen the inside of enough boardrooms to know when something important was happening. Still, even she hadn't expected him to move so quietly. To arrive not as a whisper of rumor, but as a signed reality. The company wasn't struggling. That was the surprise. It was growing. Profitable. But too safe. Too predictable. It had plateaued in its thinking while still believing it was revolutionary. The founder had stepped back, content to let the machine run on momentum. That was where he saw opportunity, not in the failure, but in the arrogance of complacency. He had made his move through a private holding group, one with no digital footprint, no press trail. By the time the due diligence had cleared and the papers were signed, it was already done. They didn't know who they were selling to. Not really. Not until he walked through the door. And now they were scrambling. The leadership team had gathered in another room trying to understand what had just happened. Some of them were digging for information, running background checks, trying to find an angle that would make this make sense. They couldn't. Because they didn't know what to look for. He didn't exist in their systems. He wasn't on the Forbes lists they read. He hadn't spoken at the conferences they sponsored. His journey hadn't followed the rules they were taught to respect. Instead, he had moved through the world like water, filling the gaps they left behind, shaping himself to fit the pressure, finding paths they didn't even know were open. His story had started in a neighborhood they only saw in headlines. The kind of place reporters visited for a few days during election cycles, then forgot. He had grown up in shadows where opportunity wasn't just scarce, it was resented. Where ambition could get you hurt. Where success was something you kept quiet, like a secret that could be stolen. He had learned early to code in secret. To study when no one was watching. To protect his vision like a fragile flame in the wind. Every setback became a data point. Every insult a reminder. Every moment someone looked at him like he didn't belong was another layer of armor. He didn't resent them for it anymore. Resentment was a waste of motion. What he felt now was precision. A cold clarity about how systems worked, who they favored, who they ignored, and how to build something stronger within their blind spots. The first meeting was with the CTO and a few of the product leads. They tried to establish authority through speed, talking fast, flooding the room with jargon, staking territory with data points and market trends. He let them talk, listened, measured, and then, with surgical calm, he asked 3 questions that unraveled everything they had just said. Not to embarrass them, to reveal the gap. It wasn't about being smarter. It was about being more prepared. By the end of the hour, the tone had shifted. The CTO leaned back in his chair, no longer trying to impress. The leads stopped looking at one another for approval and started taking notes. They didn't understand how he knew what he knew. They just knew that he saw everything differently and that nothing they were doing was invisible anymore. As the day continued, more meetings followed. Legal, marketing, finance. At each turn, he moved not as a disruptor, but as a quiet force of gravity pulling conversations toward truth. He wasn't here to overhaul. He was here to expose. To ask the questions no one inside the echo chamber had considered. By late afternoon, a few of the executives started to realize something more disturbing than just the ownership shift. He wasn't planning to gut the company. He was planning to make it better. And that meant they couldn't dismiss him as a fluke. They would have to respect him. Even if they didn't understand him. Especially because they didn't understand him. When the final meeting of the day ended, he walked the hallways of the office alone. He paused at the white boards cluttered with post-its. Looked at the framed employee photos in the lounge. Read the slogans on the walls, words like innovation, diversity, bold thinking. He smiled at that last one. Because bold wasn't a word. It was a choice. And he had been making it his entire life. The following week brought a wave of quiet resistance. It didn't arrive through confrontation or open defiance, but through subtleties, missed calendar invites, unanswered emails, forced smiles in elevators. Some of the leadership team pretended the transition hadn't happened. They continued presenting to one another as if nothing had changed, using the same lingo, the same hierarchy of attention, the same assumption that their comfort was permanent. They didn't yet understand what Andre was doing. They assumed he wanted to make cuts, push revenue, squeeze margins. That was the only kind of power they knew, control through fear, disruption through noise. But Andre had no interest in forcing his presence. He preferred patience. The kind of patience you learn when you've had to wait your whole life to be seen. Instead of dominating the space, he moved within it, joining team meetings without warning, sitting quietly in the back of product reviews, standing behind interns during lunch, listening. Watching. Not just the metrics and slides, but the people. Who spoke? Who got cut off? Who was missing entirely from conversations that affected them? He wasn't here to observe operations. He was here to understand the culture and where it rotted from. There was a strategy meeting on Tuesday. 10 people around a table, all well-dressed, all performing. The walls were covered in charts and projections, digital dashboards glowing from flat screens. One of the VPs pitched a new product line targeting underserved youth markets. Andre raised a single eyebrow, said nothing, and watched as the room nodded along. He waited until the pitch ended before asking, in a single sentence, how many of them had actually visited those communities. No one answered. That silence revealed more than the pitch ever could. He didn't humiliate anyone. He didn't need to. He simply stood up, thanked them, and walked out. The message landed. It always did. Later that day, he sent a private message to the company's community outreach coordinator, someone buried 2 layers beneath the leadership tree. A woman in her early 30s, with a reputation for being idealistic, someone who had pitched projects that were always too local or too unscalable. He asked her to draft a new outreach strategy, one rooted not in market capture but in trust building. She thought it was a joke. It wasn't. By the end of the week, her work was being reviewed in the same boardroom where she'd once been excluded. And this time, Andre was seated beside her, not above her. It shifted the energy in the room. The executives sat straighter. They listened longer. Not because they understood, but because they feared what they didn't. Across the office, a young engineer named Malik sent a company-wide email titled, "Why I Almost Quit." It was raw, specific, and fearless. It spoke of microaggressions, of feeling invisible, of constantly being the only voice of color in a room that praised itself for diversity. In the old days, the email would have been buried. Now, Andre had it pinned to the top of his dashboard. He responded not with a reply, but with action. Malik was promoted. Not for the email, but for the clarity it gave. More shifts followed. Job descriptions were rewritten. Intern pipelines were redirected toward schools that had never been on the recruiting list. Equity conversations weren't scheduled, they were embedded into every leadership meeting. The firm's tone changed, subtly at first. Its posture softened. Its curiosity sharpened. But not everyone adjusted. One of the co-founders, still technically an advisor, scheduled a private dinner with Andre. He wanted answers. Wanted to understand how someone like him had made it through the gates, into the room, into ownership. He smiled the whole time. Used phrases like mutual respect and alignment. But beneath it all was the same question Andre had heard his whole life, just dressed in designer language. How did someone from nothing end up with everything? Andre didn't explain. He didn't justify. He had nothing to prove. When the dinner ended, he paid the bill without a word. Power didn't beg to be recognized. It simply walked in the direction it was needed. That weekend, Andre took the train back to the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The buildings looked the same, chipped paint, narrow streets, the sounds of life echoing between concrete walls. But he walked with ease, not nostalgia. He wasn't there to relive anything. He was there to invest. He met with a group of high school students at the community center. Brought laptops. Whiteboards. His story. Not the version told in headlines, but the real one, about long nights, locked doors, stolen ideas, and the refusal to let perception dictate reality. He didn't preach. He offered questions. Openings. And when he left something behind. A small foundation fund, fully backed, with no strings, managed locally, focused on youth tech education. Because real power wasn't ownership. It was permission. And now he was in a position to give it. The 4th month came with pressure. Not the external kind, there were no angry headlines, no financial downturns, no lawsuits. The metrics were good. Growth had stabilized, employee satisfaction had ticked upward, even investor calls were shorter and more optimistic. But inside the company, behind the smiles and reports, there was a different kind of pressure building, cultural friction, the kind that surfaced when systems tried to change faster than the people inside them could. Some had embraced Andre's approach, even championed it. They spoke about the shift openly, the inclusivity, the new policies. They posted online, shared press clippings, added equity language to their bios. But others weren't adjusting. Not out loud, but in their patterns. They held meetings without key voices. They rolled their eyes at new initiatives, talked in quiet corners about how some of these hires aren't a cultural fit. It was the kind of pushback that never wrote emails. It moved in shadows, behind policy, under the radar. Andre saw it all. He had lived too long in rooms that only pretended to be fair. He recognized exclusion even when it wore a smile. So he changed strategy. Instead of scaling new ideas top-down, he went horizontal. He empowered middle managers, interns, even admin staff to test projects and track impact. He bypassed senior roadblocks by creating microlabs within the company, spaces where innovation could grow unfiltered by ego or gatekeeping. Within weeks, some of the firm's most exciting developments came from these corners: a prototype for a low-cost mobile platform, a new approach to onboarding that reduced attrition by half, and a mentorship program launched without budget that already had over 40 active participants. He didn't take credit. He elevated the names behind them. That unnerved some people more than if he had tried to control everything himself. The board noticed. Not with panic, but with curiosity. Their calls grew more frequent. They began asking more direct questions, not about performance, but about vision. Where was the company going? What was the long-term plan? How did these changes align with growth? Andre answered with clarity. He spoke about value beyond valuation. About building systems that didn't just perform but endured. About companies that outlasted founders because they were built for people, not press. Some of the board members nodded, others smiled politely. A few were quiet too long. He expected that. One afternoon, while reviewing internal data reports, Andre came across a familiar name in a vendor audit. It was a small firm handling secondary logistics. Harmless at first glance. But he remembered the name from years earlier, one of the companies that had rejected his first prototype pitch without a meeting, citing lack of portfolio credibility. He had walked into their office in borrowed shoes and walked out before they'd even looked up from their screens. Now they were billing 6 figures for services they barely fulfilled. He didn't call them. He didn't need to. He redirected the contract to a new vendor, one founded by 2 engineers from his old neighborhood who had been quietly running their own logistics platform for 5 years. No press release. No photo ops. Just correction. He was building something slower than people liked. He didn't care. Fast was brittle. Fast shattered when it met resistance. He was interested in weight. In things that held under pressure. And it was working. But the whispers didn't stop. That same week, an anonymous note was left in the suggestion box, something vague about overcorrection, about giving too much leeway to people who hadn't earned it. It wasn't signed, but the message was clear. He read it twice, then tossed it in the recycling bin. That Friday, he invited the entire staff to an after-hours open floor. No agenda, no deck, just a chance to talk. The turnout was hesitant at first, then steady. People came with questions, suggestions, challenges. And he listened. Not like a CEO, like a peer. Near the end, a young man asked what Andre thought about legacy. What he wanted people to remember about this chapter, his chapter. Andre paused, then said simply that he didn't want to be remembered as the owner who changed everything. He wanted to be forgotten as the owner. Because when it's built right, people stop thinking about who's in charge. They start thinking about what they can build next. And that was the point. The 5th month unfolded like a quiet drum roll. Not loud, but steady, something building beneath the surface. The company had settled into a rhythm, one shaped more by Andre's presence than by his instructions. His influence was now woven into how meetings opened, how ideas were vetted, how hiring decisions were framed. His name didn't need to be spoken for his presence to be felt. He had become part of the culture without branding himself into it. But outside the company, word had started to spread. Not in headlines or tech blogs, but through back-channel conversations, investor group chats, and insider panels. There was talk of a firm that had quietly changed hands and even more quietly started outperforming its peers in community engagement, retention, and innovation speed. Analysts couldn't point to one reason why. The numbers didn't spike, they matured. The growth wasn't explosive, it was rooted. And that made people nervous. Old colleagues, ex-partners, gatekeepers from his past began circling back. They called, emailed, invited him to panels. Some remembered him vaguely, others pretended they had always supported him. But Andre didn't play the game of pretend. He responded with silence. The kind of silence that reminded people why they had overlooked him to begin with. He hadn't forgotten. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. He knew exactly who had believed in him, who had doubted him, and who had tried to erase him. And more importantly, he remembered who had never seen him at all. He kept a folder on his desk, not digital, not categorized by logic, just names and moments scribbled by hand. Not for revenge. For context. Because legacy, to him, wasn't just about what you built. It was about how you were treated when you had nothing. One morning, while reviewing quarterly forecasts, he received a formal invitation from a major financial institution. They wanted him to speak at their executive summit on the theme of resilience and innovation in modern leadership. It was the same firm whose senior advisor had once told him, to his face, that real tech founders don't come out of places like that, meaning his neighborhood, his accent, his skin. He declined the invitation. Not with anger. Just with a reminder, some doors are better left closed behind you. Internally, Andre turned his attention to the people who were still being overlooked inside his own organization. A junior developer named Theo had been quietly pushing a new security protocol for over a month, but no one had given it attention. When Andre reviewed it, he saw potential. He called Theo into a meeting, not to praise, but to understand. 2 hours later, Theo had a team and a development window. Within 3 weeks, his work saved the company from a potential data breach. Andre promoted him the next day. No fanfare. Just results. Meanwhile, the firm's outreach fund doubled. Mentorship programs expanded. A shared workspace initiative was launched in partnership with 3 inner-city schools. Andre met with students personally, not as a figurehead, but as a translator, someone who knew both languages, the corporate one that promised inclusion and the street-level one that had never expected it. He became a bridge. But he never forgot which side of it he came from. At the same time, internal resistance found a new form, politeness. Some senior figures stopped resisting openly. They started smiling more, nodding in meetings. But they said less. They contributed less. It was a subtle kind of protest, the kind that hoped momentum would die on its own if it stopped being fed. Andre fed it anyway. He brought in fresh talent. Promoted from within. Opened new channels for collaboration where status meant less and contribution meant more. Eventually, the old guard stopped trying to push back. They started pushing out. Some left. Quietly. With severance packages and half-hearted farewells. Others requested sabbaticals and never returned. Andre didn't chase them. He understood that transformation didn't mean dragging people forward. It meant clearing space for those ready to move. He walked through the office more now. Not as a shadow, but as a signal. People greeted him. Not out of fear, but familiarity. Some still stared. Most smiled. A few asked for advice. He gave it if he had time. He never played mentor. He played mirror. On a rainy Thursday, an old friend from the block stopped by unannounced. They sat in Andre's small office, surrounded by whiteboards and coffee cups. The friend looked around, amazed, said something about how crazy it all was. Andre nodded, but his eyes were distant. Because to him, this wasn't crazy. What had been crazy was when no one believed it could happen. Now it was just what came next. The 6th month came with a kind of stillness. Not stagnation, evolution. The firm was no longer reacting to Andre's presence. It had absorbed it. New policies no longer felt experimental. They were the standard. New hires didn't seem like exceptions. They were the norm. Conversations that used to feel uncomfortable now happened without hesitation. And yet, Andre remained in the background, moving with the same deliberate calm that had carried him through every closed door he'd ever faced. There was no announcement. No big speech. No moment of cinematic closure. Just the subtle knowledge that what he had built was now moving on its own. That was the goal. Always had been. To make the system better, not to center himself within it. Leadership to Andre was never about being at the top of the pyramid. It was about making sure the base was so wide, so strong, that no one could collapse it again. Outside the company, the press finally caught up. A profile dropped, unofficial, speculative, full of holes. It tried to trace his origin, map out his acquisitions, name him as a mystery mogul from the margins. Andre didn't comment. He didn't post. He didn't retweet. He didn't show up to correct the record. He let the story twist around itself. Because the truth wasn't the point. The truth was already in motion, visible in the people he had lifted, the systems he had realigned, the places where silence had turned into agency. He spent less time in the office now. Not out of boredom or arrogance, but because he was needed elsewhere. He had begun advising other companies quietly, mentoring young founders, backing small funds for creators who looked like he once did. None of it was about making more money. He had more than he needed. It was about removing barriers before they hardened. About catching brilliance before it was buried by assumption. One evening, he stood outside the building. Just stood. Watching it glow from the inside out. The same building he had once walked into under the weight of 1,000 assumptions. The same one where whispers had once followed him like shadows. Now it belonged to no one and to everyone. And that was how it should be. He walked to the corner, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted slightly toward the sky. Rain had started to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. A few people passed without noticing him. A delivery driver hummed along to music. A woman crossed the street holding her child's hand. A young man in a hoodie waited at the light, glancing now and then at the glass building behind them. Andre looked at him and smiled. The light turned green. And he walked on. Because the world was still full of people being told they were no one. Still full of rooms where names were forgotten, where resumes were discarded, where accents were mocked and clothes were judged. And his work wasn't done until that world was quieter. Until the only thing people saw when someone walked in it was possibility.